So thank you all. And my name is Rebecca Allison. I am the program manager here at ALTEC. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And this is an ALTEC faculty workshop. ALTEC is all about languages and the faculty who teach those amazing languages. We provide a variety of programs, resources, and support to both faculty teaching languages, as well as the students who are learning languages at CU Boulder. I welcome you to contact me, visit our website, and subscribe to our mailing list if you'd like to learn more about the services that we provide at ALTEC. Today's workshop is a gender and sexuality training for language faculty and is presented by the Pride Office at CU Boulder. The Pride Office builds community and belonging for LGBTQ+ students, staff, and faculty, and strives to create an inclusive campus through education opportunities just like this. Joining us today are the Pride Office Director, Dr. Morgan Seamont. I hope that's the correct pronunciation of your last name.
Seamont.
Seamont, thank you for that. I appreciate it. He is an active advocate and mentor for the LGBTQ+ community and has been instrumental in transforming our campus into a safe place. If you have questions throughout the presentation, I welcome you to use the chat and I will interrupt and hopefully we can get those questions answered. And we'll have definitely time at the end to discuss how this is relevant to our language classroom, how we include these topics, knowing that this is an opportunity for us all to become better allies, more educated on this topic. I know I personally have a ton to learn about this topic, and I am very excited to become more educated in this area. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Morgan. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. All right, everybody see that okay? Perfect. So let's get started because I know we have a very short amount of time. We only have till 4. Is that correct, Rebecca?
That's correct, yes.
All right, so off we go. My name is Morgan Seamont. I'm the director of the Pride Center. My assistant director, unfortunately, is out sick today, but her name is Alex Dutro Maeda. I use he, him, his pronouns. And if you have any questions, I am unable to see the chat right now, but feel free to either unmute yourself and ask or put them in the chat, and Rebecca will keep an eye on that. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going to go with the training today. We're going to talk about terminology, pronouns, things such as gender, sex, sexual orientation, and then we're going to talk about how does that look like on campus. So we'll talk about our climate here, what are some of the systemic and personal issues that our LGBTQ+ faculty, staff, and students face. And then we'll look at what can we do to improve those experiences. So how do we build supportive spaces? We probably won't have time to do scenarios, but I will leave time for you all to ask questions about experiences you're having in the classroom or exchanges that you're having with students and are wondering about. And then you can always reach out to myself or the Pride Office in general and ask us questions that come up throughout the year or, you know, a consultation that you might be interested in getting around certain student interactions or classroom interactions or new rules, either on campus or in the state. So with that, here we go. To start off, we want to ensure that you know what the basic acronym LGBTQIA+ means. And this is just one of the acronyms, but probably a fairly common one. It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. And sometimes that A stands for allies as well. You will see other examples sometimes with an LGBTQ 2S, and that stands for Two-Spirit, which is another example of a gender and sexual orientation identity that may fit in that plus category. But there's some others that we've listed here are same gender loving, which came out of the Harlem Renaissance, woman loving woman and man loving man. Those come out of the African American LGBTQ community, and there's many other ones. But if we list them all out, our acronym becomes unusable. And it's fairly long as it is right now. So that's what the plus means. One thing that we want to keep in mind as I give this presentation is the idea of intersectionality. Does anyone want to throw out a definition of intersectionality or ways that you've heard this term used before?
I'll give a stab at it. I think intersectionality is when we're not defined by one specific identity, that we have multiple identities and those intersect and interact with each other.
Exactly. And all of us have intersectional identities. And it's that place where those identities may come into place. So whether that's around race, ability, gender, sexuality, religion, veteran status, age, the list can go on, but it affects the way that we interact with the world, and it affects the way the world sees us. So for example, we have two transgender men here pictured in this slide who are clearly best friends because they're high-fiving. But one transgender man is undocumented or documented, and the other trans man is a US citizen. Now, as both of these men move through their transition, they may want to legally change their name and gender marker. The documented man may be less inclined to do that due to his undocumented status, may be worried about going to court and changing his name or gender, may be worried about accessing a medical system and getting a letter verifying that he's transgender, whereas the US citizen male may feel more comfortable around that, and he may have more access to cover the costs of those changes that he wants to make to his identification documents. So even though these two men share the identity of being a trans man, their experiences may be very different based on that intersectional perspective. So we're going to start talking about pronouns. So we get asked a lot about pronouns. How do you ask somebody about their pronouns? How do you learn what pronouns they use? What are pronouns? What are these new gender neutral pronouns? So let's start off here. All of us are familiar with she, her, hers, or he, him, his. Those are the binary pronouns, and binary here refers to men and women as if they are completely separate. But there's several new variations of pronouns, the most common of which is they, them, theirs. Now, for people of my generation, we may stumble when we hear they, them, and theirs because we were taught it was a plural pronoun, and that it doesn't make any sense using it as a singular pronoun. But in fact, when they, them, theirs came into the English language, it was a singular pronoun, and somewhere along the way it got changed into a plural pronoun, and now we're just kind of using it as both a singular and plural pronoun. If you don't know somebody's pronouns yet, the best practice is to say they, them, theirs until you learn someone's pronouns. If you are talking with somebody who you haven't been introduced to yet, or you haven't had the opportunity to ask their pronouns, use they, them, theirs. Now you'll see a couple of other examples, z, zir, zirs, or per, pers. And those are also examples of gender inclusive pronouns, which are all an effort to get away from this idea that there's only men and only women. The per, pers set of pronouns was actually an attempt to get at the word person, to reflect a gender neutral perspective. You may see zir, zir, and zirs spelled with an X. So it would be, it's pronounced the exact same way, zir, zir, zirs, but there's variations on spelling. Now, we've only listed two of the newer pronoun lists for non-binary pronouns. There are many more, and we're in the middle of a gender revolution right now. We're in the middle of people rejecting strict binary understanding of gender. And in order to do that, they're trying to develop language that reflects that, that reflects identities that step outside of gender norms. And that's why we're seeing so many different variations of pronouns. Now, if we lived in a different part of the country, the South or the East Coast, we may have listed a different set of pronouns that are perhaps being more commonly used in that area.
Morgan, we have a question in the chat.
Yes.
This question is, how common and well-known are these Z and per pronouns?
I would say Z, are the most common, located here. And by here, I mean in the Boulder, Denver area. Depending on where you live in the United States, or if you're in a rural versus urban area, you may be using or more familiar with a different set of third gender pronouns. Because we haven't come to an exact consensus yet, and this is the way language develops, so I'm sure you're all familiar with it. There's still a lot of different variations floating around. And I imagine at some point we will begin to see some of these pronouns weeded out and come to some sort of consensus around what gender neutral pronouns we should use. But if you are in doubt, always use they, them, and theirs. Now, how do you introduce yourself with pronouns? Just like Rebecca exhibited for us. Hi, I'm Rebecca. My pronouns are she, her, hers. It's really that simple. And introducing yourself with your pronouns does several things other than just say what your pronouns are. It also informs everybody around you that this is a normal practice of introducing yourself with your pronouns. For those who have overheard you do it, they also know that this is an inclusive space, that it's okay to share that information with people, that this is a social norm. This is what we're trying to create, is a more inclusive environment. The other thing it does is it invites others to share their pronouns with me. So if I am being introduced to somebody who I assume may be transgender, and I introduce myself with, hi, I'm Morgan, I use he, him, his, then hopefully the trans person is going to feel more comfortable in introducing themselves to me with their pronouns. So it does several things. So next time you're in a committee meeting, make sure you introduce yourself with your pronouns, begin to set that norm as part of our culture here at CU. Okay, now we're going to move on to some of the myths that we're actually taught about sex and gender. And these are myths that are sometimes subconsciously learned just by growing up in culture. And sometimes they're more explicitly learned in a classroom, say. One of those myths is that biological sex equals gender. And another myth is that gender is binary. There's only man or woman. And what we're going to do now is explore what the reality is. The reality is that gender and sex are completely separate concepts. When we talk about sex during this presentation, we're talking about biological sex, which are the physical attributes that make up our body. When we're talking about gender, those are the socially constructed roles that have been adopted in our society as what's normal for women, what's normal for men. And then we're also going to talk about both gender and biological sex actually occur on a spectrum. So for neither one of these, there is no binary system. It is rather a spectrum with different identities that fall all along a continuum. So let's start by looking at biological sex. Now, there's many things that go into making up our biological sex, such as chromosomes, our internal sex organs, external sex organs, hormones, all the secondary sex characteristics that result from those hormones. And there's many other things that go into making up biological sex, but these are some of the major ones. Now, why do we say it's a spectrum of biological sex when typically we walk around in a world and we see women and men? In fact, about 2% of any given population identifies as intersex. And intersex means you can have a different combination of any of these factors that go into making up biological sex that are outside the norms for male or female. So we may see someone with a different set of chromosomes than we would expect. So for example, if you were to look at me, you would probably assume my chromosomes are XY, but they may be very different from that. They may be XYY, they may be XY, XXY. There's multiple variations. And in fact, most of us don't know what our chromosomes are. So Rebecca, I'm going to pick on you because you're here on my screen. I would assume that your chromosomes are XX because you appear female in your appearance. So, but have you had your chromosomes tested, Rebecca?
I have not.
Yes, and that's the case for most of us. And the reason that we say it's about 2% of any given population that identifies as intersex is because we often don't know that somebody may be intersex. You can have a different chromosome makeup and you may still physically appear very normative. Other things that go into making up our biological sex are hormones, and hormones vary throughout our lives. So we can't say that estrogen is only a hormone found in women or testosterone is only a hormone found in men, because both men and women have both estrogen and testosterone in their body. So we can't think of those as solely one sex pronouns or pronouns. One sex hormones. Some people don't actually know that they're intersex until they hit puberty, when we expect certain changes to happen. And maybe for them, those don't happen, or they happen in an unusual way. And it's then at that point that they may go visit the doctor and be like, hey, what's up? And they may figure out that they actually are identified as intersex. Other cases, for example, a 70-year-old man went in for abdominal surgery and they found that he had a uterus. Technically, he's intersex. Now, he didn't have any ovaries associated with that uterus, so it never caused him any problems. And you know, had he not had abdominal surgery, he would have never known that he had a uterus. But why do we include intersex within the LGBT community? A lot of it is because they've been treated in similar ways, in that something is wrong with them. Let's send them to a doctor to fix them. Let's make them more normative, if you will. In the past, intersex infants in the United States were often operated on in the first 48 hours of their lives, not because it was a medical emergency, but because it was a social emergency. The doctors felt they couldn't send an infant home with their parents who didn't quite fit into one sex or the other. So oftentimes their genitalia were operated on. And to be honest, it was easier to make people with for example, boys with a small penis sometimes would be made into girls because it was easier to correct the problem in that direction. Now, intersex people have done a lot of advocacy for themselves and have long argued that intersex people should be allowed to make their own decisions around their body. Unless there is a life-threatening emergency, intersex people should be allowed to grow up. They will gravitate towards one gender or the other, or somewhere in the middle, and let them decide if they want to make any physical changes to their bodies or not. I think it does. Anybody have any questions here? Otherwise, I will probably move on to gender. One thing that I do want to add that we don't include on this slide is actually there's two other big factors that go into making up biological sex. I almost forgot this before I moved on. One is the brain and one is the law or the state. So who decides the sex of an infant? Anybody just give me a shout out.
Doctors?
Doctors, right? And what do they base it on?
I'm guessing the genitalia that's presented at the time.
Exactly. They're looking at the naked little infant here and they decide whether you're a male or female. And it's only based on that one characteristic, when in fact we know that there's multiple characteristics that go into making up biological sex. Why is that a big deal? Beyond the fact that I just explained the harm that can be done to intersex people, it also follows you around for the rest of your life. So literally, once they look at you and determine if you're male or female, they're going to stamp a document, and that sex is going to follow you around for the rest of your life. Now, in Colorado and many other countries in the world, not many states though, we recognize intersex as an identifier on our IDs. So you can have X listed as your sex. A lot of systems are still trying to catch up with this. The University of Colorado computer systems are among those systems where we are trying to accommodate more than one sex. But it's important that we realize there are more than one sex. It is an actual continuum of people falling along a spectrum of sex rather than just falling into a box that says male or a box that says female. Now, the other thing that we know contributes to sex is the brain. And we know this because of transgender people. So transgender people, in the most basic definition I can give, is an inner sense of which gender you are. And for transgender people, it does not typically fit the sex that they were assigned at birth. So how many of you know somebody who identifies as trans? Just raise your hand. I'm doing a quick scroll here. I'm not seeing, right? Not everybody has, which is normal. About 80% of the population does not know someone who identifies as trans. But now you can all raise your hands because I identify as trans. Now, would any of you have picked up on that before I said it? Nobody ever does. But why do you think that is? When you look at me and you assume that I am not trans, why is that?
I think probably I would guess because you have physical, well, I can only see your physical or your facial features right now. And those features like facial hair and I can't see very clearly, maybe some baldness. Those are usually identified with as typical masculine features or male.
Exactly, right? I look like a dude, therefore you're going to classify me as a man, right? And I come out to everybody, not to sensationalize it, but to show you that you are walking amongst trans people all the time and you just may not realize it. And perhaps we need to put a pause on assumptions around somebody's physical appearance. So let's talk about gender a little more deeply and how it is also a spectrum. On this slide, you see woman on one end, you see man on the other end, and you see transgender and cisgender listed underneath there. So I actually was assigned female at birth. So when I was growing up, I identified as a woman, and now I identify as a man. And that's why you see transgender and cisgender under both of those identities, is that we can move from one to the other. Now, not every transgender person wants to solely be known as a man or a woman or the gender that they have transitioned to. For me, I identify as a trans man, and that's very important to me because it allows me to own the history that I was socialized as a woman, that I was brought up as a woman, that I have experienced life as a woman. I know what it's like to wear high heels, put on makeup, although I really sucked at all of that. But I have that experience and those perspectives. I know what it was like to be discriminated against as a woman. And if I just walk through the world saying that I'm a man, then I can't really bring any of that history with me. And that's what trans people were told to do just a couple of decades ago, is that they were supposed to give up their past, to reinvent themselves. So if I had been in Girl Scouts, I was supposed to say, oh, I went to Boy Scouts. But really, that's not my history, right? So it's very important that we be able to bring our authentic selves to the table. Now, we can use transgender, you'll see that listed here in the middle, as an umbrella term to cover a multitude of trans identities, such as genderqueer, non-binary, androgynous, and there's many, many more. But it covers what that indicates is that anybody who identifies under the trans umbrella is really trying to step out of this idea that there's only two genders, that there's only men and only women. when in fact we all occupy different spaces along this spectrum. Sometimes those identities or perspectives can change on a daily basis. There are certainly, times when I felt more masculine or more feminine, when I'm wearing a pink shirt to work versus wearing all black. But what people are trying to do is to say, who said this was the norm, that there's only two genders? When we look at genders throughout time and different cultures, we see many different expressions of gender and many different ways of understanding and implementing gender in societies. I will give a quick definition of genderqueer and non-binary because those are probably the other two most common identities that fall under trans. Genderqueer and non-binary are very close together. They're very similar to each other, but it really just means that I'm not going to identify as solely a man, as solely a woman, but I'm somewhere in between, and that's what I want to be viewed as. I'm not going to adopt the norms of femininity. I'm not going to adopt the norms of masculinity. I'm going to adopt some or both or neither. And then lastly, you'll see agender listed below this grouping of different genders. And agender means without gender. Now, for these folks, well, let me back up a little bit. How many of you have ever walked down the street and saw someone, or maybe been in a grocery store and saw someone, and you couldn't automatically figure out what gender they were? Does that happen to anybody? And did you have a hard time even, and maybe you didn't introduce yourselves, but you would have a hard time, you kind of stumble, even knowing how to relate to them. And it's because gender is one of the most formative ways that we interact with each other in Western cultures. It's built into our culture and our system so deeply that if we can't figure out your gender, we don't even know how to say hello to you, even though we don't say hello differently to men and women. We use the same word, it's the same term, but we stumble when we can't figure out someone's gender. People who identify as genderqueer and non-binary are sort of challenging us to examine, why is gender constructed the way it is? Perhaps we don't have to follow all of the rules or all of the norms or abide by gender roles that we've developed for our society and culture. For agender people, gender may not be the way that they walk through the world understanding each other. It may not be that classifying force that it is for most of us. And they want to be completely separate from gender. Now, is that completely possible in Western society, especially in the US? It's difficult to pull off. You can certainly identify as agender, meaning I just don't feel like I fit any of the genders. But to have the world look at you and reflect that is much more difficult because we live in a gendered society. So let's move on to gender expression. These are the ways that we actually express our gender to the rest of the world. What do people think is the number one way that we express our gender here in the US? Anyone?
I would guess clothing. It's sort of a social thing that begins with, the whole gender reveal. It's going to be blue or pink, right? And then that determines what kind of clothing you'll be gifted for your unborn child.
Yes. That's great. We are assigned a color, right? Automatically. Clothing is definitely the number one way that we express our gender. Walk into any department store, there is an obvious women's section and an obvious men's section. If you've ever looked at button-down shirts, men's shirts button on the opposite side of women's shirts. There's certain colors associated with the men's section versus the women's section. And it's also a way that we can see how gender roles and gender itself has evolved more recently over the last few decades. So for example, my mother, when she went to school, she never wore pants. And it wasn't because it was a uniform school. It was just that women during that age did not wear pants where she was growing up. Now, if I were to be able to see the bottom half of most of the women on this call, you're probably wearing pants. A few of you may be wearing skirts or dresses, But we see it all the time that women wear pants now. It's part of what's the norm for women. We don't see the opposite, though. We haven't seen clothing expansion for men. We don't see men wearing dresses or skirts or any of the other effeminate ways that we express our gender through clothing, right? If we do see it, how do those men get categorized? Sometimes as metrosexuals, right? The man who cares a little bit more about his appearance. So we can see how things have changed over time by looking at clothing. And we can do that with other ways that we express our gender. So hair is another example. Women typically have long hair, men typically have short hair, but we've seen a lot of changes, especially in how short women can now wear their hair and how long men can now wear their hair. But you can imagine that there were many arguments in the 1960s during the hippie movement when men started to grow their hair long, that was a big deal between fathers and sons. And why did fathers not want their sons to have long hair? Anyone?
It would be viewed as effeminate.
Exactly. The only men who were allowed to have long hair probably pre-1950s was if you identified as Native American, right? Had a different connotation in that culture. But in US Western society, it was considered effeminate. And to be honest, if you look at FCQs for male professors with long hair, they will get lower FCQ scores and often have comments written about the length of their hair and how distracting it was or how messy it was. So we still see some discrimination related around the norms for men's and women's hair length. Now, other ways that we express our gender are through our mannerisms, and these are often learned subconsciously, right? It can be sitting, it can be talking, it can be occupying space. If I were in the room with you and looking at how men and women are sitting right now, women tend to sit more confined with your arms crossed, your legs crossed, not taking up a lot of space. Men may do the man spread, right, where they take up 3 seats on the subway. They tend to put their elbows out more to take up physically more space. And those are all things that we learn by watching other men and women and what they did. Sometimes it was from direct information from our parents, usually a mother telling their daughter, sit with your legs crossed, put your legs together. So those are other ways that we express our gender. And sometimes for trans people, these are habits that they try to break or habits that get noticed. So you can't see all of me right now, but I'm told that I talk more like a woman in that I use my hands more. Apparently women do that more. So there's subtle cues to how we understand people's gender. Other ways that we express our gender are through our voice, especially if we're talking with someone on the phone. We make an assumption of someone's gender based on the pitch of their voice, right? Names are also another good example to examine how things have changed over the last few decades. So every masculine name, well, almost every masculine name has a feminine form. So James is Jamie, Michael is Michaela. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank. Alexander is Alexandra. We can see that they have changed to expand to cover more genders than just male genders for those names. But we don't see the opposite again. We don't see masculine forms of Jennifer or Rachel or Susan. And that tells us a lot about what parents are doing. So names may not be so much of what we're expressing as what our parents are expressing around their infant's gender. So we also see a lot of gender neutral names now. So for example, Taylor used to be a boy's name, and we see it quite frequently with girls now. Same thing for Morgan, actually. Used to be strictly a boy's name, and now we see many girls named Morgan. Why do you think parents are giving their children more androgynous names like that? Any thoughts?
Well, if the parents are very thoughtful about, this subject matter, then might help the person avoid maybe making a name change if they do transition from one gender to another, or also letting the child decide what their gender is and not having it be really decided by a gendered name.
That is very forward thinking. Thank you for that answer. Nobody has actually come up with that yet. And I like the idea. I don't know how many parents are doing it with that in the back of their minds, but most parents in the moment in time that we're at right now are giving their girls gender neutral names to improve their chances of success in their career fields. We know that if a man and woman, well, if you have the exact same resume and you put Rachel on one of those and you put Robert on the other, who's going to get more callbacks for that resume?
The male presenting name.
Exactly. There is still so much bias towards men, especially in very particular fields, engineering or any of the STEM fields. We know that there's implicit bias, and a lot of parents are keeping that in the back of their mind when they give their girls an androgynous name to try to step outside of those biases. Now, there are, I'm sure, many other ways to express gender, but we wanted to talk about some of these in order to tell you and to show you how gender has changed and evolved. And to say that transgender people are something new in the world isn't actually true. There are multiple ways that gender has been expressed throughout time and throughout different cultures. And they may involve any of the items that you see on your screen there regarding how we express gender. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the myths that we're taught about sexuality. First, we're taught that heterosexuality and binary gender are the natural order, and that all of these new LGBTQ identities are new. We're taught that sexual orientation is all about attraction to physical parts. And lastly, we're taught that everyone experiences sexual attraction. But let's talk about the realities a little bit. Same-sex relationships and gender expansive behavior are found throughout human history and, in fact, in the natural world as well, and throughout many different cultures in the world. And for some people, attraction is based foremost on things like gender, personality, emotional connections, and other factors that go into making up that connection between two people. It may not just be based on sexuality or parts, if you will. And then lastly, some people experience sexual attraction only in certain situations or not at all. That's the reality. Let's look at these in a little more detail. So just like gender and biological sex, sexual orientation and spectrums of sexuality occur all across this spectrum. So to start off with, we have a spectrum between gay and lesbian and straight. Those are certainly the most common identities that we're familiar with. What these identities actually have in common, gay, lesbian, and straight, is that they're attracted to only one gender, whether that be the same gender or the opposite gender. Now, what we find that falls in between those two points on the spectrum, if you will, are examples. We put two examples here, bisexual and pansexual. Those are the two most commonly heard ones. And there's a lot of discussion about how these two orientations are defined, and people may define them differently for themselves. But the common definitions of bisexuality are that it means they're attracted to men and women, or they're attracted to the same gender and other genders, and that's the bi, the two. For pansexuality, it may be defined to mean that that they are attracted to people and personalities rather than specific gender identities. Now, there's also a multitude of different ways that we express bisexuality or pansexuality, but it is a spectrum. It's not an either or, that there's only being queer and only being straight. There's actually a lot of sexualities in between. Now, our next spectrum up is the asexuality spectrum. And this is when people experience sexual attraction, on a regular basis. That's what allosexual means. This is the norm in our society when we assume that people are going to grow up and be attracted to other people and want to have sexual intimacy. But some people actually don't experience sexual attraction, and those people are termed asexual. Now, asexuality is a very broad spectrum in itself. Some people may never experience any sexual attraction and just don't want to have intimate relationships. And some people only experience attraction occasionally or in specific situations. And we call this the gray ace spectrum. This includes some commonly heard asexual orientations such as demisexual, where people only experience sexual attraction when they've already built up an emotional connection. So it can be very situational. And the last spectrum we have there is monogamy and polyamory. Now, monogamy is usually what's expected of us societally here in the West, that we'll only have one sexual and romantic partner at a time, and that we're seeking a long-term relationship. And hopefully that relationship will last, until we die. Polyamory involves sexual or romantic relationships with multiple people at a time. And these arrangements are different based on the needs of the folks involved. So for one person, they might have a primary life partner and then multiple secondary relationships. Or you might have an exclusive relationships with 3 or more people all dating each other as equal partners. And sometimes this is framed as just a decision that someone makes, but some people describe themselves as actually being hardwired for polyamory. So we want to get to the idea that it's part of who they are. It's not necessarily just a choice or a lifestyle. It's also really important that we note that cheating is not polyamory. A true healthy polyamorous relationship, everyone is aware of the situation and has given consent to what's happening. Any questions on this? Okay. Let's move on to talking about what the campus climate is. So the last campus climate survey, it's quite dated now, was done in 2014. We're actually doing one right now, so hopefully we'll have new data by the spring. But in the 2014 survey, we noticed that both our undergrad and graduate LGBTQ plus students were leaving at higher rates than their straight peers. There were several reasons for this, and that's what we'll talk about next, is what are some of the systemic issues, those larger institutional issues that our LGBTQ plus students face. One is around financial support. We know that 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. That means that our LGBTQ students are still losing a lot of family support when they get here. They may be coming from the foster system, they may be coming from homelessness when they enter college here. Families also, even families who do not directly out or kick out their children from their home may still not support them well. So one of the big challenges is financial aid for these students. Now, there is a way for students to apply for financial aid through an exception form where they don't have to document their parents' tax income. But if a student doesn't know that, then they may not be applying for school because they believe they can't afford it or can't get any financial aid to get them through it. Housing is another big issue. if you identify as LGBTQ, you may not feel safe in housing living with somebody who identifies as cisgender and straight. And cisgender meaning that you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. Other things are access to facilities. On a daily basis, trans people may face increased risk and danger in using public restrooms. Here on campus, we do try to have gender inclusive restrooms in every building, but we don't. We are still working on that. And as buildings get remodeled, we try to create more restrooms, so that is something that's fulfilled. We do have gender inclusive locker rooms at the rec center, and we do have gender inclusive housing for students. So we've done a lot on this campus to improve our LGBT inclusion here. Now, the biggest one that still affects our students is the social exclusion. And this happens a lot in the classroom and in everyday life. The people making assumptions that say, if you look at me, you assume I'm straight and you assume I'm a male. And that's something we want you to walk away with from this training, is to put a pause on that. Is maybe he looks like a man, but maybe I don't actually know if he identifies as a man. Maybe he looks straight, but maybe I don't actually know if he's straight. So let me put a pause on that assumption. By putting a pause on those assumptions, we may change the language that we use. We may be using more inclusive terms. So if we're talking about boyfriends and girlfriends, maybe we talk about partners, and instead of using such gendered language. Now, social exclusion, we also wanted to bring up the fact that there were over 100 different anti-trans or anti-LGB legislation introduced in 33 different states over the summer. That was to prohibit anything from prohibiting trans students in athletics to criminalizing the medical care of transgender youth. So while we think we're in a very inclusive moment in time around LGBTQ rights, we may not actually be that inclusive right now. Now, some of these systemic problems that LGBTQ students face also have a high personal impact. So, for example, depression and anxiety contributes to increased mental health problems with our LGBTQ students. Many of these students are impacted heavily by this, and most of the studies have been done on high school students. So they're already coming into college with major depression and anxiety to the point that it can prohibit their success. What that also means around harassment and safety is that, number one, they may be coming from a homeless situation. So if you are homeless, you're automatically more at risk for physical violence. You may be having been outed by your parents and kicked out of your house by your parents. You're probably experiencing more harassment and discrimination, not just from your parents, but your extended family and those around you who now know that you identify as LGBTQ. When we talk about a sense of belonging here, we're talking about it on campus. So how do we ensure that our LGBTQ students feel like they belong on campus? Part of that is around creating safety for them. And that means having an LGBTQ center, a place where they can go and sort of relax, knowing that they can actually be themselves, that they can authentically bring all of their self into the center. We also provide support, and there's many other centers across campus that provide support for our LGBTQ students, such as the BOLD Center, there's student groups, OSTEM, and GSA, and many other ways that the university provides support. But we want to go beyond just providing resources and safety and support. And that's why we hold events that really celebrate LGBTQ identities, because we don't just want to be concentrating on, let's make sure that you're safe. We want to go beyond that and celebrate the identities. And we also have to recognize that the LGBTQ movement itself has often been exclusionary, meaning that people of color have been excluded during the 80s and 90s, and even the 2000s. The acceptable face of being the LGBT movement was the gay white man or the lesbian white woman. That was acceptable, and we weren't necessarily accepting of trans people or accepting of LGBT people of color. So we know that we have work to do on our own as well.
And Morgan, I just wanted to mention that we had a question in the chat if there was a map of where gender neutral bathrooms can be found around campus. And I included a link to the CU Boulder map. And if you click on services and then select gender neutral bathrooms, you will see those locations.
You are absolutely right. So perfect. Good for knowing that too. We do have some things that we wanted to highlight really quickly, that there is a trans care team here at CU that works out of the health center that assists our trans students, and our CAPS, counseling and psychological services, also has a support group for trans students. We talked about housing, that we do have LGBT housing, both an LGBTQ student can live anywhere on campus and we will support them. But we do have certain floors on Willville East and in Hallett Hall that are LGBT floors. Talked about housing and locker rooms. We do have a number of different student groups on campus that are LGBTQ focused, and we, as the Pride office, assist them with events when we can. And students can also change their name, pronouns, gender identity, and sexual orientation within their student portal. And this is a big one for students who don't use a legal name and would prefer some other name. That they can do that in their portal and not have to come out to anybody is one of the advantages of doing it that way. So with that, I want to save the rest of the time for questions. So I will get out of sharing. Maybe. Okay, there we are. So
thank you so much, Morgan, for sharing this. I want to start with saying thank you for providing us the opportunity to hear from you specifically about your personal story and your experience. I know that must be challenging at times to share with certain populations. I appreciate you being willing to share your experience with us. That's very helpful. I feel a lot more educated on this topic, knowing a lot of terms that I didn't realize were even terms. So thank you for educating me and allowing us to understand the experiences that the LGBTQ plus community has. I wanted to note in the chat that someone shared that beyond BIPOC, we might have folks who are disabled, who have disabilities, who, that contributes to the intersectionality there. And then finding all of these supportive spaces on campus is really helpful for us. I know that we have a few people who need to jump out to go to other meetings. So thank you if you need to go. We certainly understand. At this time, I'd like to offer their space for everyone to share their experiences. If you have questions for Morgan, this is a great time to do that. Or if you want to share how you are presenting these topics in your classroom, that would be also a great time to do that.
Hi, my name is Ayal. I use he, him pronouns. Thank you. Again, this was a beautiful presentation, and I feel like also I learned a lot and helped clarify some of the terms for me. I just want to share quickly and also leave time for other people as well, of course. I was born and raised in Israel, and Hebrew is a very binary language, and which creates binary thinking because of the language. And I've been teaching here at CU for about 10 years now. And I've had trans students before, and they identified either male, female in the class. So it worked in here. Within about 3 or 4 years ago, had a prospective student say, hey, I would like to join the Hebrew classes. And I noticed that at their signature, it said they, them, pronouns. And I said, wonderful. And by the way, I noticed your signature. How would you like to do this in Hebrew? And they said, I don't know. And I said, I don't know either. And we both started researching this and connecting. I went to colleagues in Israel, and Lior researched other languages. Lior is my student, and they're okay with me sharing this story.
Yeah.
And we ended up experimenting in the classroom and creating basically a new systematics for Hebrew to add a non-binary ending, a suffix. And first it was just in the class, and we were experimenting with it because Lior didn't want to identify either as male or female. And what I found was it worked. We kind of refined it, and it worked really well. At the end of the semester, hey, maybe we can share this, and we shared it on Facebook and put up a little website, and it went viral. I mean, it was just, the response was so beautifully touching, and literally hundreds of letters. And what it made me realize is the importance, first of all, myself as an ally and as a person, as an educator, the role that I have to create safety and inclusion, and also how the language shapes our thinking and can either exclude or exclude. And now, kind of connecting with people in Israel, realizing it is really hard to identify as non-binary in Israel because of the language. The language itself is what limits the possibility for that. So our system is really taken off, and people are now using it in curriculums and education and in prayer books, even in Jewish prayer books and stuff like that. But still the biggest, and that's mostly in this country and in the world, but in Israel, that's where the push is like, no, you can't do this. This is our language. You can't touch this kind of thing. So it's been an interesting conversation, and I'm taking the role of, well, this is what I need to do in my classroom so that I create a safe, but there is definitely a push from the Hebrew Academy of like, who are you? You can't do this kind of thing. So, but changes happen from the ground up, and my role is to show up for it and do my part, and then see how, where it grows from there. So I wanted to share that.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a great story. I love that. Language change in action.
Right.
And I want to share that, Ayal, I've put that link in the chat to the non-binary Hebrew project, and we had another comment of how this is in the news recently. I am constantly hearing about this in the news, and I'm like, this is our professor at CU. This is so exciting. We're doing such amazing work here, and it is really incredible to know that we are making waves and celebrating this work. So thank you for being here, Ayal, to share your project and hopefully inspiring others to do similar work.
And I also noticed that now, since then, I have more students identifying as non-binary in the classroom. And I think part of it is because of that, because it creates the invitation and the safety to do that.
Absolutely. Yes, the LGBT community as a whole is very good at sharing good news like that. So we're like, that's the professor you want to go to. So thank you so much. That's a great way to show allyship. And I know we're at time, but if any of you have any other questions that you would like to ask me, I put my email in the chat. You can always reach out to me, and I'm happy to chat anytime.
Thanks so much, Morgan. And I want to just have just one more second to ask if anyone has any recommendations for those who might be joining us later in terms of watching this recording. Does anyone have any advice for language faculty who might be interested in starting the conversation about this within their classroom and are maybe intimidated or nervous about how do you present this within a world language curriculum? Does anyone have any good tips of how do we start this conversation? How do we make it feel a little less scary?
I can speak to that. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you so much, Morgan. This is a fantastic presentation, and it was just everything was very clear, and again, I agree with Ayal. Very beautiful presentation. So thank you so much. I'm just going to, I guess, my comments here to just reinforce what Morgan already said, and just normalizing, first of all, normalizing sharing your pronouns. It's one of the first things that I do in my class in order to create the conditions where people can share if they want to. I make sure that I don't ever ask anyone directly what their pronouns are, because that can be very uncomfortable for people, but modeling that sharing is helpful. And that usually elicits a positive response, and people, young folks do this better than older folks, right? It's just, they are happy to share. And also, sharing that if we're meeting remotely, just very explicitly on our little Brady Bunch pictures here. But also, Canvas is my love language, so I put a lot of resources at the very beginning of where to find how to use non-binary pronouns in the language that I teach, which is German. And then in all of my examples, when I'm, first level German, when I'm teaching he, she, I add the non-binary, so they learn right away how to use it grammatically. And then in all my examples, I use XIR and not just ARZ. I use all three as examples, just to normalize its use and to help folks feel comfortable using it. And they can decide themselves if they want to practice or if they want to use XIR in the classroom, and how they want to be identified too, as Ayal also shared with us and modeled that. But the other thing that I do is put a lot of resources for queer, gender, non-binary, and trans folks, not just with the language, but also resources. So that link to as for the map of the bathrooms is very useful. And any of this other things that you mentioned, Morgan, I think I will start to include that. So thank you so much for those resources. It's really helpful.
Yeah.
But my students, I've had a lot of positive response to these things, and there's so much more I could do, but this is I've got a lot of resources here. So thank you so much.
Great.
I think we can also invite our colleagues to start sharing those prominent figures who are part of the LGBTQ plus communities who are in our languages. So thank you all again for coming today and for sharing and being comfortable to explore this topic with us. I invite you all to join us for our next faculty workshop, which is next Thursday. That's our SLA reading group. The topic for this semester is intercultural competencies. And if you have any topics that you would like ALTEC to focus on in the spring, I invite you to reach out to me to either say, I need education in this topic, or hey, I'm doing this really cool thing in my classroom and I'd love to share that with my colleagues. So I invite you to reach out to me and let's share our expertise, our knowledge with one another and grow professionally. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Morgan. And I wish you all a great rest of your week.